This officer believed his badge made him immune to decency, treating this diner like his private kingdom until he misjudged the day and the witness. You won't believe what happens next. Make sure you stick around for the climax. Hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're joining us from. The diner had occupied that specific street corner for decades, predating most of the staff who currently hustled inside. Its red leather booths were fissured and scored, bearing the history of countless hurried meals. The material cracked from the repetitive friction of bodies sliding in and out. The vinyl had split in strategic, high-wear areas, amateurishly sealed with dark, sticky patches that stood out like clumsy scars against the faded crimson, never quite matching the original hue. The floorboards didn't just creak. They groaned a low, guttural note of tired acknowledgement with every step, as if the building itself possessed an ancient memory and knew precisely the maximum weight it could still reliably bear. The air hung heavy, a permanent suspension of burnt coffee grounds, rendered bacon fat, and the deep, inescapable scent of ancient fryer oil, a smell that had become structural, defying industrial cleaners. Morning light struggled to filter through the wide front windows, glass streaked with the grime of forgotten rains, dust motes catching the sun like tiny, golden witnesses to the relentless, unchanging routine played out below. This entire establishment ran on the momentum of habit. The bell above the entry door rang with the same dull, metallic sigh each time a customer entered, and the same handful of heads would turn automatically, performing a quick, bored identity check before reverting to their plates. The regulars arrived at their appointed hours, ordered their habitual meals, lodged the same predictable minor complaints, and departed, leaving the standard, identical tips. The walls were plastered with yellowing, forgotten photographs of long-lost neighborhood baseball teams, and laminated newspaper clippings so faded no one bothered to decipher the headlines anymore. Time did not progress here. It circled endlessly, a slow, grinding mechanism that eventually wore people down until they learned to move with the current rather than fight against its inevitability. She had absorbed that lesson early. The waitress had been upright and serving since before the first whisper of dawn, and the relentless ache in her calves had long since settled into a dull, constant, subterranean throb that no longer even registered as a surprise. She navigated the narrow aisles of the diner with a practiced efficiency that bordered on automation, balancing trays and plates as though they were lightweight, seamless extensions of her own weary body. Her uniform, which had started its life crisp and hopefully bright, had been laundered so many times that the fabric had softened into something closer to a symbol of comfortable resignation than actual comfort. A few damp strands of hair had escaped the elastic of her ponytail, clinging stubbornly to her forehead, slick with perspiration despite the mild temperature outside. She repeated the mantra of her luck. I am lucky to have this job *, like a necessary, bitter medicine, especially on the mornings when she knew she faced 2 shifts back-to-back. Lucky because rent did not grant extensions. Lucky because the stack of unpaid bills on her kitchen table did not care about her exhaustion or her fading dignity. Lucky because, as people often insisted, there were definitely worse places one could be employed. The deeper truth was that she stayed because fear was a quieter, more familiar companion than the unpredictable, raging beast of hunger. Around her, the diner began to fill steadily, gathering volume as the lunch hour approached its peak. Plates clattered, forks scraped a harsh rhythm against the porcelain, and conversations overlapped into a low, perpetual hum. A few coworkers moved alongside her, their faces molded into the same carefully constructed neutral expressions that she wore. They had all learned the cardinal rule of survival here: never react too strongly to anything. In this environment, any display of genuine emotion was a costly liability. At the counter, the manager stood rigidly, arms crossed over his chest, surveying the room with the detached, almost mechanical focus of someone counting down the minutes of his sentence rather than actively observing the people he employed. He had once been a louder, more opinionated man, but years of mediating petty customer complaints and avoiding staff confrontations had meticulously worn away his edges. Now he chose silence and studied indifference as often as possible, convinced in his weary heart that the sheer act of not noticing a problem was precisely the same as having solved it. The doorbell chimed again. a sound that, this time, seemed to inhale the surrounding noise, and the atmosphere shifted in a way that was instantly subtle but deeply unmistakable. A few conversations paused for exactly half a second before resuming at a markedly lower volume. Someone at the counter sighed, an almost inaudible release of tension. The waitress did not need to lift her head to know who had just entered the room. He came in like he had purchased the establishment that morning, his posture loose and arrogantly confident, his heavy boots sounding less like footsteps and more like impacts against the worn linoleum. The small, polished badge on his chest caught the filtered light briefly as he passed the windows, a bright, metallic symbol that seemed to grant him universal permission to conduct himself however he pleased. He wore his uniform the way some men wear armor, not for protection, but as a deliberate demonstration of power, fully conscious of how it instantly altered the gaze of every person in the room. Chairs scraped violently as he pulled one out without so much as a glance or a request, settling deep into his usual booth near the center of the room, positioned to command maximum visibility. "Coffee?" he announced, not to anyone in particular, but over the room, his voice loud enough to carry through the hum. "And don't water it down today, I need the sludge." The waitress felt her shoulders immediately tense, a reaction she consciously and instantly ordered them to suppress. She picked up a full pot and approached his table, already bracing herself internally for whatever specific, unpleasant tone he chose to deploy next. He watched her as she poured, his eyes tracing her movements, holding her gaze a second too long, the slight curl of his lip an expression she recognized as predatory amusement. "Long face today," he drawled, his voice loud enough for the 3 surrounding booths to hear clearly. "Come on, waitress, put a little polish on that frown. Makes the place look slightly less depressing." A wave of forced, nervous laughter rippled from nearby tables, the sound strained and artificial. Others instantly pretended to be profoundly absorbed in their menus or plates. The manager, counting change with meticulous fervor, glanced up, registered the scene, and instantly retreated, transforming a harmless stack of napkins into an urgent organizational crisis. She forced a polite, vacant expression onto her features and murmured some meaningless, neutral acknowledgement, setting the heavy cup down with meticulous care. Inside, something twisted, that familiar, corrosive mixture of hot anger and deep humiliation that she had learned years ago to simply swallow whole. It was always easier this way. Arguing never, ever ended well, especially when the man doing the talking wore a polished badge and a sidearm. This pattern was not new. Everyone in the diner was intimately familiar with it. He had been a daily fixture for months, always in uniform, always deliberately loud, always testing the invisible boundaries of how far he could push. He delivered casual insults, demanded special treatment that bordered on ridiculous, and complained bitterly about service that every other customer accepted without issue. Each time, the reaction was identical. Awkward, nervous laughter, lowered eyes, and, crucially, silence. Silence was the unwritten rule, the lubrication that kept the gears of the diner operating smoothly and without confrontation. As she retreated from his table, balancing another precarious tray, she felt the full weight of the room pressing in around her. The narrow aisle between the rows of booths seemed tighter than usual, crowded not just with bodies, but with tense, collective expectation. She reminded herself to watch her footing, to be exquisitely careful. Careful had long ago become a fundamental, ingrained reflex. Near the far side of the diner, a man sat alone at a booth by the window. He had arrived quietly, taken his seat without drawing any attention whatsoever, and ordered a simple, unremarkable meal. His plaid shirt was neatly pressed and buttoned, his hands resting on the tabletop with an air of profound stillness, as though he had nowhere else in the world to be and all the time ever needed to be there. He did not speak much, but his eyes moved constantly, following the currents and flow of the room with calm, unblinking attentiveness. He saw the precise moment the waitress's practiced professional smile evaporated the second she turned her back on the officer's booth. He noted the manager's calculated cowardice, his deliberate indifference, and the way the nearby customers leaned deep into their conversations, desperate to signal their non-involvement. He noticed the vital, unspoken details that most people had actively trained themselves to unsee. The lunch rush grew heavier, and the general sound of the diner swelled to a high-pitched, uneven roar. Orders piled up on the pass, and the waitress found herself moving even faster, her exhaustion somehow sharpening her focus instead of dulling it. She told herself she only needed to push through this next hour. After that, the flow might thin. After that, she could briefly inhale. From his booth, the officer leaned back and performed a slow, exaggerated stretch, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He watched her cross the aisle again, a look of idle, anticipatory amusement on his face. The older man by the window watched too, though his expression remained perfectly unchanged, perfectly neutral. The diner carried on, trapped firmly in its established routine, entirely unaware that the delicate silence it depended upon for peace was already beginning to fracture. By the time the lunch rush fully took hold, the atmosphere in the diner felt thick, like a sealed room deprived of fresh air. Voices overlapped in a chaotic, uneven rhythm. Plates slid across the stainless steel pass, and the bell above the door rang frequently enough to lose all individual meaning. To anyone observing from the street, the place looked like a model of thriving business. To those inside, it felt like an extended exercise in endurance. The police officer sat in his usual booth as if the custom furniture had been specifically commissioned and built around his physical dimensions. He leaned back with an ease that suggested absolute, total ownership. One arm was draped casually along the top of the seat cushion. The other rested near his coffee cup. The badge on his chest caught glances whether he actively intended it to or not. People noticed the small, reflective symbol before they allowed themselves to notice his face. That was precisely how the dynamic always worked, and he understood it intimately. He had learned years ago what the uniform did to a crowded room. It straightened backs, it quieted voices, and it established a careful, invisible distance that people rarely dared to trespass. Even those who privately disliked him found themselves pausing, measuring their words, consistently choosing silence over risk. He deeply enjoyed that pause, that microscopic moment when people internally recalculated their own status and behavior around him. It made him feel solid, securely anchored, functionally immune to consequences. To the regular clientele, he was now simply a fixture, an unpleasant part of the scenery. Some nodded in automatic, nervous habit. Others made a point of avoiding all eye contact. A few laughed excessively loud at his cutting remarks, mistaking performative agreement for genuine safety. The waitress saw all of this from the periphery of her vision as she moved constantly between the tables, efficiently delivering plates and refilling water glasses with the same practiced, rote motions. She had served him enough times to recognize the entire, predictable pattern. It invariably began with a demanding request thinly disguised as a joke. Then came the direct criticism, delivered loudly enough for a surrounding audience to hear. Finally, the absolute expectation of compliance, as though her obedience were simply the most fundamental part of the service contract. "Hey!" he called out, his voice sharp and penetrating, just as she passed his booth again, carrying a heavy tray loaded with plates. "You forget about me already, carrying all those plates?" She stopped immediately, turned slowly, and forced herself to meet his aggressive gaze. Her pulse gave a sudden, hard quickening beat, but her voice remained outwardly steady as she asked precisely what he needed. The older man by the window watched this exchange with intense scrutiny, fixing his attention not on the trivial words exchanged, but on the subtle, involuntary shift in her physical posture. The way her shoulders drew inward just slightly, a tiny motion of self-preservation. The officer smirked. "Relax. I'm just saying service used to be faster around here. Or maybe you're just distracted today." A few customers glanced quickly over. Someone near the counter snorted quietly into their coffee cup. The manager looked up sharply, took in the entire scene, and then spun away again, choosing a register that demonstrably did not need balancing over a confrontation he desperately wished to avoid. The waitress nodded once and offered an apology, though she knew intrinsically that she had done nothing wrong. Apologies had morphed into an internal reflex, one that required no actual thought and offered no tangible relief. As she moved away, she felt the familiar, hot burn of embarrassment rising swiftly in her chest, immediately followed by a deeper, colder frustration she kept carefully contained. The officer watched her go, entirely satisfied. He enjoyed the reliable effect he had on the people around him, the way they spontaneously bent and accommodated his presence without needing to be explicitly told to do so. In his mind, this was not cruelty. It was simply maintaining order. He believed that firmly, even proudly. People needed constant reminders of their place in the hierarchy, and he was merely fulfilling that necessary function. Around him, the diner resumed its nervous dance of avoidance. Conversations picked up again, but at a distinctly lower volume. A man at the counter shifted uncomfortably on his stool and focused his entire attention on the remnants of his plate. A woman in the next booth whispered something quickly to her companion, then fell absolutely silent when the officer casually glanced their way. The older man by the window did not look away. His eyes followed the officer's movements with quiet, unsettling precision. He noticed how the man had deliberately spread himself out in the booth, how his heavy boots extended farther into the narrow aisle than necessary. He noticed how the officer's laughter was always timed, how it consistently followed moments of discomfort rather than genuine humor. These were not random accidents or coincidences. These were choices. As the waitress returned to the swinging doors of the kitchen to pick up another complex order, she allowed herself a single, deep, silent breath. Her hands trembled briefly as she steadied the heavy, stainless steel tray. She told herself she could endure this precisely as she had endured it countless times before. The idea of actually speaking up or fighting back felt impossibly distant and completely unrealistic, like imagining an entirely different life in another country. When she stepped back into the dining area, the narrow aisle between the two rows of booths seemed impossibly crowded. Plates passed dangerously close to elbows, and chairs jutted out at awkward, challenging angles. She adjusted her grip on the tray and focused entirely on the path ahead, reminding herself again to stay absolutely alert. The officer shifted slightly in his seat, watching her approach. His gaze flicked briefly down toward the aisle, then back up to her face. A faint, calculated smile crossed his lips, the kind that never quite reached his eyes. To him, this whole interaction was a small, ongoing game, played out in deniable, subtle gestures. He knew the precise, invisible line he could cross without provoking open, official challenge. The older man saw the look and felt a familiar, sickening tightening in his chest. It was the instant recognition of a long-established pattern he had witnessed before, in many different places and under many different uniforms. Power testing boundaries and silence granting permission. He took a sip of his coffee, still warm, and settled back to wait. The waitress passed the officer's booth again, this time marginally closer. Her attention split precariously between balancing the heavily loaded tray and navigating the treacherous aisle. He said absolutely nothing as she went by, but his physical presence felt suddenly heavier, more deliberate, more consuming. She felt it. An intense, unwanted attention she could not quite identify, without truly understanding the cause. Behind the counter, the manager glanced quickly at the wall clock and frowned. The rush would certainly last another agonizing hour at least. He told himself firmly that he would deal with any problems later, when things inevitably calmed down. Later had become his favorite, most frequently used word. The officer leaned back even further, stretching his legs fully beneath the table. One heavy boot slid forward just enough to intentionally intrude into the aisle, though not so much that anyone could accuse him of a clear, actionable obstruction. He watched the waitress with lazy, expectant interest, already mentally imagining the inevitable outcome he expected. If anything happened now, it would, by default, be her fault. It always was. The older man noticed the calculated movement immediately. His gaze sharpened instantly, his attention narrowing entirely to the few inches of space between the toe of the officer's boot and the precise path the waitress was taking. The entire room seemed to decelerate, the noise fading into a distant, underwater murmur as quiet, certain anticipation settled over him. Around them, the diner continued to function, entirely unaware that something fragile was hanging in the balance, seconds away from breaking. The silence that had held everything rigidly in place for so long held steady, stretched thin and taut by the combined forces of habit and fear. No one spoke. No one intervened. For the waitress, it was just another step in another impossibly long shift, taken under the combined weights of expectation and sheer exhaustion. She did not see the boot until it was far too late. The moment of collision did not arrive with any dramatic warning. It did not announce itself with raised voices or sudden, confrontational movement. It slipped into the diner quietly, perfectly wrapped in the ordinary, dull sounds of a busy lunch hour, hiding seamlessly behind the relentless clatter of plates and the low, constant murmur of conversation. The waitress stepped into the narrow aisle with the practiced, automatic rhythm she had perfected over years of demanding work. The tray in her hands was heavier than usual, loaded with plates meant for a large booth near the far wall. Her fingers tightened slightly around its metal edge as she subtly adjusted her balance, her eyes flicking ahead to meticulously map out a clear path. She had learned long ago to anticipate obstacles before they physically materialized, to navigate bodies and furniture with the surgical precision of someone who simply could not afford mistakes. The aisle felt unbearably narrow now, choked by chairs pulled too far back and heavy boots that edged just a little too far out. She shifted her weight forward, committing fully to the next step. That was when her foot met resistance. It was not a shove, nor a forceful kick, merely enough solid pressure to abruptly and completely stop her forward stride. Her shoe caught against something solid, unyielding, exactly where the floor should have been clear. For a fraction of a second, her body failed to process what had occurred. Momentum carried her weight forward while her foot remained trapped, and the world tilted violently in a way that made her stomach drop and churn. Her knee bent instinctively, trying desperately to compensate. The tray lurched sharply in her hands, the plates sliding against each other with a sudden, sharp, unmistakable scrape. Her free foot searched frantically for the floor, her exhausted muscles straining to recover a balance that had already begun its irreversible slip away. Time stretched thin and rubbery, every single sensation amplified in that brief, terrible instant. Then the sound came. Porcelain struck the floor with a brittle, shattering crash, followed instantly by the wet, sickening splatter of hot food and the dull clatter of heavy silverware. The noise cut through the diner like a physical blade. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Forks froze halfway to mouths. The bell above the door rang faintly as someone new entered, then fell silent again immediately. Somehow, she managed not to fall completely to the floor. She caught herself against the solid edge of a nearby booth, her heart hammering a violent, panicked rhythm in her chest. One hand clenched the remaining metal edge of the tray while the other braced against the upholstered seat. Her breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. Her face flushed instantly with a sudden, burning heat. For a moment no one spoke. Then laughter rippled through the room. It began at the officer's booth, low, booming, and supremely confident, and spread unevenly as others. He raised his hand slightly in mock surprise, shaking his head slowly. "Careful there," he said loudly, his voice dripping with false concern. "You really ought to watch where you're going." The words landed harder and with more effect than the fall itself. The implication was clear, rehearsed, delivered with the practiced ease of someone entirely accustomed to being immediately believed. He did not look at the spilled food or the jagged, broken plates. He looked only at her, waiting for the expected response. Submission. Her mouth opened slightly, then snapped shut again. A dozen desperate thoughts collided violently in her mind, none of them managing to form words she felt remotely safe enough to speak aloud. She looked down at the humiliating mess on the floor, at the sharp fragments of what had been only moments ago a routine, manageable task. Her hands trembled visibly now, no longer capable of hiding the deep shock running through her body. From behind the counter, the manager stepped forward, his face already set into a weary expression of profound irritation. He surveyed the scene quickly, his eyes moving critically from the broken plates to the officer, then settling with disapproval on the waitress. "What happened now?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the specific answer he wanted to hear. "She tripped. The officer replied smoothly, his tone conversational and flat. Nearly took me out with her. A few people chuckled again, softer this time. The waitress swallowed hard, her throat painfully tight. She wanted desperately to scream something, anything, but the words felt dangerously heavy. The manager sighed, rubbing his forehead as though this were merely a minor inconvenience to his inventory rather than a clear injustice. "You need to be more careful," he said sternly to her. "We can't have avoidable expenses like this." The shame hit her in a searing wave so strong it made her lightheaded and dizzy. She nodded automatically, the obedient reflex kicking in, bending down immediately to gather the sharp pieces of broken plate, her fingers brushing against the cold, sticky floor. Each movement felt exposed, agonizing. Every second stretched under the unbearable weight of watching eyes. The officer continued to grin, calmly sipping his coffee as if absolutely nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. His boot finally withdrew from the aisle, retreating casually beneath the table. The absence of it felt almost mocking, as though it had never been intentionally there at all. At the far booth by the window, the older man had not shifted an inch. His coffee sat untouched now, a thin line of steam rising slowly from the cup. He had witnessed everything. The precise, intentional placement of the boot. The moment her foot caught. The split second of hesitation before gravity took its natural toll. There had been no accident here. No clumsiness, only calculated intent followed by instant, practiced denial. He watched the waitress crouched on the floor, her shoulders drawn inward as she meticulously cleaned up the mess that was demonstrably not hers to own. He watched the officer's satisfied expression and the manager's quick, quiet complicity. Something settled heavily in his chest, a familiar, deep weight he had hoped never to feel again. Around them, the diner gradually resumed its rhythm. Conversations restarted, though more cautiously now. Plates were replaced, orders were shouted sharply back toward the kitchen. The sound of forced laughter faded away, leaving behind an uneasy, unsettled quiet that no one dared to address. The waitress straightened slowly, her hands sticky with spilled food and residue. She avoided looking at anyone at all as she carried the remains of the damaged tray toward the swinging kitchen doors. Her legs felt weak, her balance profoundly uncertain, as though the very floor itself could no longer be trusted to be stable. Behind her, the officer took another satisfied sip of coffee. He had proven his point publicly and without consequence. The silence of the room had done the rest of his work for him. At the window, the older man finally set his cup down, the ceramic clicking softly against the saucer. His gaze followed the waitress until she disappeared completely behind the swinging doors. The crack in the diner's silence had widened irreversibly, and he knew beyond a doubt it would not close again. The kitchen was always infinitely louder than the dining room, but it felt safer in ways the waitress could not fully articulate. The hiss of the grill and the cacophony of pans created a solid wall of sound that wrapped around her, effectively muting the residual echoes of laughter and judgment she had left just moments ago. She stood rigid at the stainless steel counter, hands braced against its cool, industrial surface, focusing every ounce of will on slowing her frantic, ragged breathing. The heavy, greasy scent of frying onions and spent cooking oil clung to her uniform and hair, an immediate visceral anchor that tethered her to the present reality when her fractured thoughts threatened to scatter into useless panic. Her reflection stared back from a dull, highly polished metal panel, a face that looked infinitely older than it had that morning, the lines fanning around her eyes etched deeper, her mouth set in an unfamiliar, defensive configuration. She wiped her hands on a worn, damp towel, observing how they still betrayed her, trembling faintly despite the deliberate, cold scrutiny she directed toward them. The broken plates lay in a busbin nearby, the ceramic fragments stacked haphazardly like pieces of evidence gathered but destined never to be formally examined. She commanded herself to move, to initiate the necessary sequence of action. There were orders hanging in the window, tables expecting service, a vital rhythm she urgently needed to rejoin before it slipped irrevocably out of her reach. But her feet remained planted, refusing immediate response. The catastrophic moment in the aisle replayed itself in unforgiving clarity. The pressure on her ankle, the sickening loss of gravity, the sharp burst of collective laughter that followed the crash. It all merged into a single, crushing weight that pressed down hard on her diaphragm. For years, she had mastered the art of absorbing such moments quietly. She had painstakingly convinced herself that endurance was the only viable strength, that silence was a refined, necessary form of survival. It was always easier to accept reflexive blame than to risk the unpredictable nature of retaliation. Easier to apologize for an imagined offense than to attempt a futile explanation. That particular logic, a tired, painful calculus, had successfully carried her through countless small humiliations, each one filed away and deliberately forgotten in the name of practicality and keeping the peace. But this time felt structurally different. This time, an essential boundary had shifted, or perhaps broken entirely. When she finally shoved through the metal swinging doors and stepped back onto the main floor of the dining room, the renewed wave of noise struck her like a physical blow. The lunch rush had not merely maintained its pace. If anything, it had surged, growing louder, as though the small incident had only sharpened everyone's appetite for distraction and drama. She forced her body to adopt a walk defined by purposeful efficiency, her posture unnaturally straight despite the deep, aching tightness coiling in her neck and shoulder muscles. The officer was, of course, exactly where he had been. He sat with calculated ease in his booth, one uniformed arm casually draped along the worn vinyl backrest, his expression relaxed, open, and utterly unconcerned. He was speaking animatedly to a man at the neighboring table, his voice projecting easily, carrying above the persistent din. When he noticed her returning, his eyes flicked toward her path briefly. A swift, almost imperceptible flash of amusement crossed his features before he casually redirected his attention. She felt her jaw instinctively tighten, locking the muscles until they ached. The deliberate absence of an apology, the sheer refusal of acknowledgement, burned hotter and deeper than any explicit insult could have. He had not only entirely escaped consequence, he had been instantly rewarded with the silence and compliance of everyone present. This raw, heavy knowledge settled like a cold stone in the pit of her stomach. As she passed the counter, the manager intercepted her gaze. For one hesitant moment, she imagined he might actually speak. A quiet apology, perhaps, or even a simple inquiry into her welfare. Instead, he gave a curt, impatient gesture toward a nearby table that needed clearing, his face already turning away before the signal was complete. The message was brutally clear and efficiently delivered. The incident was officially closed, done, and dismissed as far as he was concerned. Only the work remained. She managed a small, automatic nod and continued her motion, though the action felt entirely disconnected from any genuine agreement or compliance. Each step she took carried her farther from the familiar, self-sacrificing version of herself that had accepted this type of treatment without question or protest. That version still existed, certainly hovering too close, but it no longer felt like the only available option for survival. The officer's voice rose sharply and suddenly, cutting through the dense noise of the room. "You okay back there?" he called out, the surface tone not overtly unkind, framed in a veneer of theatrical concern. "Wouldn't want you hurting yourself again, now would we?" A few nearby heads pivoted immediately toward her, and while the words were constructed as a casual inquiry, the nervous, stifled laughter that followed from his table revealed their true, mocking intent. She stopped short, the empty tray in her hands feeling suddenly, unbearably heavy. Her first deeply ingrained instinct was to deploy the usual script, to reassure him and everyone else that she was perfectly fine, that the fault had been entirely hers. This time, however, the rehearsed words caught violently in her throat, refusing to form. She stood frozen, the entire room seeming to wait in a manner that felt utterly unbearable. Heat rushed rapidly into her face, and she felt the familiar, desperate urge to dissolve, to retreat instantly back into the hot sanctuary of the kitchen and let the unbearable moment pass. But something, a new, rigid core, held her firmly in place. The memory of her foot catching, the sharp sound of plates shattering, the way not a single person had spoken up to intervene. It all pressed forward now, demanding an accounting. "I'm fine," she said finally, her voice quiet but entirely steady, free of the waver she expected. It was not an apology. It was not even an explanation. It was simply an unadorned statement of objective fact. The officer tilted his head slightly, his smile momentarily absent as he studied her. For a stark moment, his expression hardened, as though he were calculating precisely how far he dared to push this emerging defiance. Then he flashed the easy smile again, leaning back comfortably in his seat. "Good," he said, the word dismissive. "Just be careful next time." The tension in the room did not dissipate when she finally moved away. If anything, it metastasized, spreading and settling into the peripheral corners of the room where people were now overtly pretending not to notice. A woman in the next booth watched her momentarily with an expression that looked vaguely like sympathy, before quickly glancing down at her plate. A man seated at the counter shifted his weight uncomfortably, his fork hovering uselessly above his breakfast. At the far end of the diner, the older man by the window had been a meticulous, silent witness to the entire unfolding sequence. He had seen the way the waitress had paused, the almost imperceptible way her shoulders had squared just slightly when she spoke that simple phrase. It was a minuscule change, nearly invisible to anyone not actively searching for it. But he noticed. He also noticed the officer's subtle reaction, the cold calculation operating just behind the casual smile. He knew this moment intimately. He had encountered it before in countless different forms and in places far removed from this quiet, brightly lit diner. This was the precise moment when a social line was tested, when the long-established power of silence was challenged just enough to provoke a definitive response. It was a highly dangerous moment, one that could only end in full retreat or painful escalation, and it was a moment that rarely resolved itself organically. The officer seemed genuinely energized by the brief exchange. He began to speak more loudly, his jokes becoming sharper, his comments edged with an unmistakable, thinly veiled challenge. Each remark was meticulously crafted to remain just within the hazy bounds of deniability. Anyone passively listening could easily convince themselves that the talk was harmless banter. Yet anyone watching closely could easily see the corrosive intent vibrating beneath the surface. The waitress moved through the room with a renewed, almost desperate focus, absolutely determined not to let him observe how deeply his persistent words were affecting her. But the immense effort took its toll. Her hands ached from gripping the edges of trays too tightly. Her shoulders burned with sustained tension. She caught herself flinching violently when bursts of laughter rose unexpectedly, her body instinctively bracing for another anticipated blow that might never materialize. The manager remained conspicuously absent from the unfolding situation. He busied himself distractedly with paperwork, then abruptly shifted to the register, then to mundane tasks that conveniently allowed him to avoid all possible eye contact. Each time the officer's voice rose in volume, the manager's jaw tightened visibly, but he remained paralyzed and silent. He had learned over time that intervention inevitably brought complications, and complications invariably threatened the delicate stability of his operation. Stability, however fragile, was his highest and only priority. The older man felt a familiar, deep frustration stir within him, not the explosive rage people often anticipate, but a steady, clarifying resolve. He had spent the majority of his life navigating opaque systems that depended entirely on silence, on the willing complicity of bystanders who simply agreed to look away. He had learned the precise cost of inaction, not through academic theory, but through the hard currency of experience. Sitting there now, he felt the heavy weight of that painful knowledge pressing against him. He watched the waitress expertly clear a nearby table, her movements precise, almost pathologically controlled. He saw the deliberate way she avoided the officer's gaze, avoiding it not solely out of fear, but out of a fierce, draining resolve. She was holding herself together entirely through sheer force of will, and he knew intimately how swiftly that fragile structure could collapse under continued, focused pressure. The officer's attention returned to her again as she passed the periphery of his booth. He shifted subtly in his seat, angling his body slightly toward the aisle. His posture was deceptively casual, almost lazy, but the intent was now unmistakable. He was openly testing her, testing the room, testing the limits of what he could achieve without being formally challenged. The older man's patience thinned to nothing. He recognized that moments like this did not resolve themselves through passive hope or prolonged endurance. They resolved themselves solely through action, through the willingness of a single person to deliberately disrupt the established pattern. He thought of the countless times he had walked past injustice because it had seemed temporarily smaller than the perceived risk involved. He thought of the faces he could no longer forget, the moments that returned to him uninvited in the quiet, empty hours of the night. He had promised himself years ago that he would not be silent again when it truly mattered. Across the room, the waitress set a tray down on the counter and straightened, her eyes briefly meeting his in an accidental connection. Fleeting and completely unspoken, yet carrying immense weight. In her expression, he saw profound exhaustion, yes, but he also saw something else. A silent question, perhaps, or a fragile hope she did not yet dare to fully voice. The officer laughed again, louder this time, successfully drawing the full attention of the room back to himself. The abrasive sound grated sharply against the older man's nerves. He finished the rest of his coffee in a single, resolute swallow and placed the empty cup down with deliberate care, precisely aligning it with the edge of the table. The gesture felt profoundly ceremonial, a quiet, inward acknowledgement of a decision already irrevocably made. The diner continued its frantic, oblivious routine. Plates moved. Orders were called out. The bell above the door rang again as another customer entered. But beneath the noisy surface, something fundamental had changed. The suffocating silence that had governed the room for so long was no longer intact. It wavered, uncertain and brittle. The older man slid out of his booth and stood tall. He did not rush the movement. There was no discernible urgency in his actions, only focused purpose. He adjusted his plaid shirt, smoothing the fabric as though preparing for a perfectly ordinary conversation. To anyone observing casually, he might have seemed like just another customer stretching his legs before departing. But to the officer who noticed him rising out of the corner of his eye, something immediately felt wrong, fundamentally off balance. The laughter caught briefly in the officer's throat as he turned his head, a flash of pure, calculating curiosity flickering across his face. The waitress saw him too. She paused mid-step, her heart beginning to pound heavily as she watched the older man take a slow, deliberate step toward the aisle. She did not know what he intended, only that his calm, unhurried presence cut through the room's noise in a way nothing else had managed. The breaking point had arrived, not with a shout or a violent crash, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had simply decided that maintaining silence was no longer a moral option. When the older man finally stepped into the aisle, the movement barely registered at first. In a room accustomed to constant, chaotic motion, one more figure rising from a booth seemed unremarkable. Chairs scraped, plates shifted, and the steady, demanding rhythm of the diner carried on without apparent pause. But something in the way he moved caused a subtle, almost instantaneous change. A faint, collective hesitation in the noise that no one could quite locate or explain. He did not hurry. His worn boots touched the linoleum floor softly, deliberately, each step placed with careful intention. The plaid shirt hung loosely on his broad frame, worn but impeccably clean, and his posture was straight without being overtly rigid. There was no visible aggression in his stance, no theatrical display meant to draw attention. He walked as a man walks when he knows exactly the coordinates of his destination. The waitress watched his steady approach with a complicated mixture of confusion and intense apprehension. Her immediate, ingrained instinct was to retreat, to make herself smaller, to remove herself entirely from whatever inevitable confrontation was about to happen. Years of habit urged her to disappear before trouble found her again. Yet, she stayed exactly where she was, frozen by curiosity and a fragile thread of hope she did not yet fully understand. The officer noticed him then, truly noticed. His smile faded completely as his eyes tracked the older man's deliberate path through the diner. At first, his expression held only mild, dismissive interest, the casual, practiced assessment of someone accustomed to being the most dominant and authoritative presence in any room. He leaned back slightly, crossing his arms as though settling in to watch a minor, easily resolved inconvenience unfold. The older man stopped immediately beside the officer's booth, close enough that their proximity could not be ignored, but not so close as to feel physically threatening. He looked down at the seated officer calmly, his gaze steady, level, and unblinking. "Mind stepping outside with me for a minute?" he asked. His voice was remarkably even, entirely unhurried, carrying just far enough to be heard clearly by those nearest to them. There was no discernible anger in the tone, no direct accusation. It was the kind of voice one used when discussing ordinary, trivial matters, when expecting simple compliance rather than complex resistance. The diner fell quiet in a way that felt profoundly unnatural. Conversations faltered, words trailing off into embarrassed silence. The rhythmic clatter of dishes slowed, then stopped completely. Even the grill in the kitchen seemed to hiss more softly, as though aware it was intruding on a critical moment. The officer blinked once, clearly taken aback. He glanced swiftly around, registering the sudden, focused attention directed entirely at him, and a slow, amused grin spread across his face. "Outside," he repeated, the word laced with mockery. "For what?" The older man did not look away or break the contact. "For a conversation," he said simply. A faint ripple of nervous, quickly stifled laughter moved through the stunned room. The officer chuckled, shaking his head slightly. "You got a problem with something, old man?" he asked, his tone still light, but noticeably edged now with a sharp challenge. "I do," the older man replied, his voice still level. "And I think it's better handled away from everyone else." The waitress held her breath, unable to move. She could feel her heartbeat pulsing loudly in her ears, insistent and demanding. Part of her screamed internally to warn the older man, to tell him to drop it, to leave it alone, to protect himself before the situation inevitably turned against him. She had seen exactly how these things always ended. People who dared to speak up rarely walked away unscathed. The manager hovered anxiously near the counter, his hands clenched tightly together. He looked momentarily as though he might intervene, then abruptly thought better of it. His eyes darted rapidly between the two men, mentally calculating the risks he desperately did not want to take. The officer studied the older man much more closely now. He seemed to take in the deep lines etched into his face, the calm certainty radiating from his posture, the lack of hesitation in his eyes. Something indefinable flickered across the officer's expression. A brief moment of uncertainty instantly masked by renewed bravado. "You trying to tell me how to behave in public?" he asked, his voice suddenly louder. "I'm asking you to step outside," the older man stated. He did not raise his voice. He did not repeat himself unnecessarily. The silence deepened, growing suffocating. The officer shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his confidence wavering just enough to be noticeable to a keen observer. He was perfectly accustomed to intimidation, to people instantly backing down when challenged by authority. This was different. The man standing before him did not seem remotely impressed by the uniform, the badge, or the authority they represented. After a long, strained moment, the officer laughed again, though the sound now rang noticeably hollow and forced. "Fine," he conceded, pushing himself aggressively up from the booth. "Let's talk." He stood up fully, towering slightly as he straightened, and for a brief, terrifying instant, the entire room held its breath. The waitress felt a cold surge of fear, entirely convinced she was about to witness something violent she could never unsee. The older man simply stepped aside, gesturing toward the main door with a small, quiet tilt of his head. They walked together across the diner floor, the officer leading by half a step, the older man following with unsettling calm. The small bell above the door rang sharply as they passed beneath it, the sound sudden and loud in the abrupt quiet. Then they were gone. For a long, paralyzing moment, no one moved. The waitress slowly exhaled, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. She leaned heavily against the counter, her hands gripping its edge to steady herself. Around her, people exchanged uncertain, tentative glances. Some looked visibly relieved, others profoundly unsettled. A few stared fixedly at the closed door, as though expecting it to burst open again at any second. The manager cleared his throat loudly and spoke at last, his voice strained and reedy. Let's get back to work," he said, clapping his hands together weakly in a gesture that failed to command. The spell was broken, though not completely. Conversations resumed in hushed, careful tones. The clatter of dishes returned, but it was softer now, as though everyone were nervously testing the exact volume they were permitted to use. The waitress operated purely on instinct, clearing a table, refilling a glass, her mind still fixed entirely on the two men outside. Minutes crawled by, stretching longer than they should have. Every external sound from the parking lot made her heart jump violently. She imagined raised, angry voices, the impact of fists, the flashing, urgent lights of backup. She imagined professional consequences she desperately did not want to face. Outside, the air was cooler, carrying the harsh, dry scent of asphalt and car exhaust. The officer stopped near his patrol car, turning to face the older man with a grin that no longer seemed even remotely convincing. "So," he said, attempting to regain control, "you got something to say? Say it now." The older man met his gaze evenly, refusing to be rushed. "You don't treat people like that," he stated simply, his voice devoid of heat. The officer scoffed, throwing his head back. "Like what? You mean harmless jokes? An accident?" He gestured vaguely toward the diner's entrance. "Lighten up, old-timer. That wasn't an accident," the older man replied, his tone unwavering. The officer's fragile smile finally vanished. "You accusing me of something? I'm telling you I saw it," he said. "And I saw what came after." The officer's jaw tightened hard. For a brief moment, he looked away, then back again, his expression hardening into something defensive and mean. "You think you know what you saw? I do." The conversation ended there. What followed did not carry across the parking lot in shouts or dramatic physical gestures. There were no drawn-out verbal exchanges, no spectacle meant for an audience. Whatever happened unfolded quickly, decisively, and without any witnesses. Inside the diner, the waitress obsessively wiped the same spot on a clean table twice without realizing it. Her thoughts raced, her entire body braced for the unknown. She had spent so long believing that speaking up only guaranteed things would get worse that she could not possibly imagine any other outcome. The bell above the door rang again, and all heads turned in unison as the door opened slowly. The older man stepped back inside, his expression entirely unchanged, his movements as calm and deliberate as they had been before. A beat later, the officer followed. He did not look the same man who had left. His posture had fundamentally shifted, his shoulders now drawn noticeably inward as though carrying a sudden, immense weight he had not anticipated. His gaze avoided the room, fixed instead rigidly on the floor a few feet ahead of him. The swaggering confidence that had dominated the diner earlier was gone, replaced by something brittle, defeated, and restrained. No one spoke as he walked quickly back to his booth, collected his jacket, and left without uttering a single word. The bell rang once more as the door silently closed behind him. The silence that followed was entirely different from the heavy, suffocating silence that had come before. It was heavier still, but also clearer, stripped bare of pretense and anxiety. The waitress felt something deep inside her chest loosen, a relentless tightness she had not even fully realized she was carrying until it began to slowly fade. The older man returned to his table, sat down, and calmly reached for his wallet. When the waitress approached him hesitantly to clear his now empty place, he looked up at her with direct, compassionate eyes. "You did nothing wrong," he said quietly, his voice a bomb. She swallowed hard, nodding, utterly unable to find words that felt remotely adequate for the moment. He left a generous, neatly folded tip on the table and stood, offering her a small, brief, reassuring smile before finally turning toward the exit. As he left, the bell rang one last time. Its sound was no longer sharp or intrusive, but oddly comforting. The diner resumed its established rhythm, but nothing felt quite the same as before. The quiet, calm voice that had broken the silence still seemed to echo faintly in the air, leaving behind the powerful promise that some ingrained patterns, once forcibly disrupted, could not be so easily or fully restored. The diner did not immediately return to full life after the door closed behind the officer. Sound crept back slowly, as if the room itself needed time to fully adjust to the consequential shift. A fork clinked tentatively against a plate. Someone softly cleared their throat. The grill in the kitchen resumed its steady hiss, finally filling the heavy silence that had lingered just a moment too long. Yet, something profound and fundamental had shifted in the atmosphere, and everyone felt it acutely, even if no one dared to name it aloud. The waitress stood near the counter, her hands resting lightly on its edge, her body still half expecting the tension to violently snap back into place. Her eyes automatically tracked the space where the officer had been. The now empty booth looked strangely, disconcertingly ordinary. Just a collection of vinyl and a table holding a cooling cup of coffee. Just a few minutes earlier, it had felt like the very center of gravity for the entire room. Now it was merely furniture. She waited for the familiar rush of fear, the delayed, sickening realization that consequences were inevitably coming for her defiance. It did not arrive. Instead, there was a fragile, unfamiliar calm, almost unsettling in its quiet certainty. Her breathing slowed and deepened, and with it came a cautious awareness of her own physical posture. She noticed with a faint shock that she was standing straighter, taller than before. Around her, the patrons consciously avoided one another's eyes. No one commented openly on what had transpired. There were no questions, no speculation spoken aloud. Yet, a deep, immediate understanding moved through the room like an unspoken, shared agreement. People had seen enough. They had seen who had left first and how. They had seen who returned entirely unchanged and who returned diminished. The manager still hovered near the register, his expression permanently strained. He glanced nervously toward the door, then toward the waitress, and then his attention snapped away again, unable to find a stable anchor. For the first time since the humiliation had unfolded, his eyes flickered and settled on her with a momentary uncertainty, a flicker of something that resembled shame or perhaps just disbelief at the turn of events. He opened his mouth as if to attempt a clumsy explanation or challenge, then shut it immediately, choosing the safety of silence over initiating a conversation for which he had no script. The waitress returned to her duties slowly, almost cautiously, as though testing the stability of the floor she walked on. Each movement felt weighted, not because the structure of the diner had shifted, but because the internal map she used to navigate it had been fundamentally redrawn. She began to clear a messy table, wiped down the sticky formica surface, and moved to the next station. No one risked a sarcastic laugh. No one whispered a commentary about what had just transpired. A woman sitting alone in a nearby booth caught her eye and offered a faint, small smile, a gesture that seemed to carry the complex dual weight of both genuine sympathy and deep, personal regret for her own earlier silence. The waitress did not know how to process or reply to this sudden acknowledgement, so she simply offered a slight, formal nod and continued her methodical routine. At the far counter, the older man sat utterly still, meticulously finishing the final sips of his coffee. He did not crane his neck to observe the shifting atmosphere or gauge the reactions of the remaining patrons. He did not seek recognition or applause for his intervention. He had already accomplished the subtle, necessary deed he came to perform, even though he likely hadn't known its true purpose when he first walked in that morning. Now, he simply allowed the room to absorb and process the consequences on its own timetable. The officer did not return to settle his bill or reclaim his previous authority. Minutes bled into one another, then more. The urgency of the lunch rush began its slow dissipation as customers quietly settled their tabs and filtered out, the bell above the entrance ringing with a noticeably softer, less jarring frequency. With every single departure, the diner felt tangibly lighter, less constrained by the suffocating, unspoken weight of fear and complicity that had compressed the air for too long. The waitress became acutely aware of the officer's absence. With every passing moment of unchallenged movement, she realized how utterly accustomed she had become to constantly anticipating his presence, calculating every step, every tone, and every glance to avoid provoking him. The profound relief of no longer having to perform this intricate mental calculus was almost dizzying, like suddenly stepping out of a storm she had been walking through for so long that she had forgotten the precise sensation of clear, calm air. When she approached the older man's table, she hesitated slightly, unsure if he required a refill or anything further. He looked up at her, his gaze steady and clear, and shook his head gently. "No, thank you," he confirmed. She reached automatically for the check, but he had already handled the transaction. The currency he left behind was far more than generous, but it was not the monetary amount that truly held her attention. It was the absolute, quiet deliberateness of the gesture, the way the bills were placed neatly, almost ceremonially, on the table, rather than crumpled or tossed aside in a casual afterthought. "You don't owe me anything," he said quietly, as if he were reading the precise, chaotic gratitude unfolding in her mind. "Just remember what you saw today." She nodded again, the tightness in her throat preventing speech. She desperately wanted to offer comprehensive thanks, or perhaps ask him the questions that tumbled through her thoughts, but she sensed acutely that this particular moment required no verbal exchange. He stood smoothly, adjusted the hem of his jacket, and moved toward the exit without offering a backward glance. The bell chimed softly as he stepped outside, and this time the sound did not carry any tension or anticipation. It rang like a firm, necessary punctuation mark, signifying the quiet end of something that had been permitted to persist for too long. After he was gone, the diner continued its slow, inevitable return toward a new baseline of normalcy. The manager finally mustered the courage to approach the waitress, his voice subdued, hushed, and profoundly uncomfortable. "You handled yourself well," he managed to articulate, the words stiff and unfamiliar, alien in his own mouth. She looked at him, startled not by the hesitant compliment itself, but by the complete lack of any accompanying apology for his inaction. She realized, with a sudden, startling clarity, that she didn't need one from him. Whatever paralyzing fear or complacency had kept him silent before was likely still a part of him, but his silence no longer possessed the power to define her position or her worth within the four walls of the diner. "I just did my job," she replied simply. He nodded, visibly relieved by the brevity and simplicity of the exchange, and retreated quickly back behind the safe confines of the counter once more. The afternoon light shifted subtly as a bank of clouds drifted overhead, altering the precise colors and tone of the diner in minute, almost imperceptible ways. Shadows lengthened and crept across the patterned floor. The world outside continued its indifferent, steady rotation, paying no mind to the quiet but profound seismic shift that had taken place inside these walls. Yet for those who had witnessed it, the few staff and remaining regulars, the memory lingered, not as a sensational spectacle to be recounted, but as a quiet, internal understanding. No one had actually seen what unfolded in the parking lot, and no one needed to. The visible result spoke with overwhelming eloquence. The waitress finished her shift later than usual, a profound exhaustion settling deeply into her bones now that the surge of adrenaline had completely evaporated. As she untied her stained apron and hung it meticulously on its hook, she caught her reflection in the same shiny metal panel she had faced earlier that day. This time, she barely recognized the woman staring back. She did not look fearless. She still looked deeply tired, worn down by the day's events, but there was something anchored and steadier in her eyes, a firmness of resolve that had been entirely absent before. She realized that, for the first time in memory, she was not obsessively replaying the searing moment of humiliation. Instead, she was remembering, vividly, the singular moment someone had finally stepped forward. When she stepped outside, the air was cool, clean, and refreshing. The parking lot was utterly silent, empty of the hulking patrol car that had been a fixture there. She paused for a long moment, breathing deeply and letting the weighty silence settle fully around her. Inside the diner, life continued its essential motion. Orders were placed, Coffee was poured. But beneath the familiar surface, the old, rigid rules had been fundamentally disturbed. Silence had been unequivocally challenged, and once challenged, it could never fully reform into its previous absolute shape. They had not witnessed the confrontation outside, but they understood the implications, and that shared understanding was enough to subtly change everything. The diner opened the next morning, exactly as it always had. The same familiar bell chimed above the door. The same comforting scent of stale coffee and hot grease drifted through the small room. The same worn booths waited patiently for the same regulars. On the surface, absolutely nothing had changed. Any stranger walking in for the first time would have seen only a typical, familiar greasy spoon continuing its established routine, unaware that something subtle but entirely irreversible had already taken root. The waitress arrived early, her steps slower than usual, her body still heavy and protesting from the long emotional shift the day before. Sleep had been fragmented, broken by half-remembered, disjointed images and moments that replayed themselves without conscious invitation. Yet when she pushed open the heavy door and stepped inside, she felt an immediate, palpable difference. The air was changed, not necessarily lighter, but clearer, as though years of stale, bottled-up emotion had finally been ventilated. She tied her apron with deliberate focus and moved behind the counter, exchanging quiet, measured greetings with the cook and the manager. The manager nodded at her, hesitated visibly, and then offered a faint, fleeting smile. It was not a warm expression, nor was it a particularly brave one, but it was something. She returned it without conscious effort, mildly surprised by how little emotional cost it required. As the morning progressed, customers filtered in. A few glanced furtively around the room as if expecting some element to be conspicuously out of place. Others settled quickly into their usual seats without comment. The booth near the center, the one that had served as the officer's de facto throne, remained empty far longer than it normally did. No one dared to mention its vacancy, but the void was deeply noticed. The space where the officer had once sat now felt entirely neutral, stripped of the oppressive, negative gravity it had carried for so long. The waitress moved through the diner with a quiet steadiness that genuinely surprised even herself. She was still physically tired. Her feet still ached from the standing. The work itself was certainly no easier than it had been the week before. Yet, she noticed that her shoulders no longer hunched instinctively when she passed certain tables. She was no longer constantly mapping her movements around a single, dominating presence, no longer bracing herself internally for a sharp, condescending voice she dreaded hearing. A woman seated at one booth thanked her quietly when she brought over a plate of eggs, meeting her eyes for a fraction of a second longer than was strictly necessary. A man sitting at the counter left a significantly larger tip than usual and said absolutely nothing about it. These were minuscule things, easily dismissed in isolation, but together they formed a quiet, undeniable pattern that did not go unnoticed by the staff or by the waitress herself. The manager watched her from behind the counter, his expression thoughtful, bordering on pensive. He remained silent, but he intervened quickly when a customer raised his voice unnecessarily at an order mistake, stepping in with a firm authority he had never displayed before. The exchange was brief and awkward, but the crucial thing was that it happened. The waitress caught the moment from the periphery of her vision and felt something settle quietly inside her. It was not gratitude she felt, but a profound sense of recognition, that the burden had subtly begun to shift. The day moved steadily onward. By the afternoon, the diner had slipped back into a familiar rhythm, but the rhythm had subtly altered, like a classic song being played at a slightly different, more relaxed tempo. The silence that had once governed the room no longer felt monolithic or absolute. It had cracks now, thin but visible, where the sound of genuine laughter and the possibility of resistance could finally slip through. The waitress thought of the older man as she wiped down a table near the large window. She did not know where he had gone or what the rest of his life entailed beyond that brief, sharp intersection with hers. She knew only what he had done and the precise, altering way it had diverted the course of her day and, perhaps, her entire future. His words returned to her mind unbidden. "You did nothing wrong." They no longer felt like a simple comfort or a kind reassurance. They felt like undeniable truth. She realized that she had been measuring her worth against other people's expectations and judgments for so long that she had entirely forgotten how to define her own. The humiliation she had endured had never been hers to carry, no matter how relentlessly it had been placed in her hands. Truly seeing it, was deeply unsettling. It left her unsure of what step came next, but also strangely and powerfully unafraid. The officer did not return that day. He did not return the next. At first, the waitress still caught herself listening intently for the familiar, arrogant cadence of his voice, the heavy, distinctive sound of his leather boots. Each time the door opened, her body reacted, a sudden tightening in her chest, before her mind could fully intervene. But with each slow, passing day, the instinctive reaction faded. The absence grew into something solid, something reliable. It became an established fact rather than a tenuous hope. Other customers noticed it, too. Conversation shifted subtly around the center booth. The overall tone of the room softened perceptibly. Laughter sounded different, lighter, less forced. The diner had not magically become a sanctuary, nor had it transformed into some idealized version of a perfect workplace. It remained exactly what it had always been. A slightly worn place where people came to eat, to pass time, and to exist alongside one another. But one pervasive source of fear had been removed, and the vast, empty space it left behind was profoundly noticeable. One evening, as the waitress counted out her tips near the service station, she realized with a start that she was no longer dreading the prospect of the next shift. The thought surprised her deeply. Work was still work. The hours were still punishingly long, but the dread, that constant, low-level, internal tension she had mistakenly accepted as normal, had finally loosened its paralyzing grip. She stepped outside after closing and stood for a moment beneath the fading light, watching the sky darken above the empty parking lot. The world beyond the diner continued in all its indifference and complexity. Nothing about the grand machinery of the universe had changed because of what happened here, and yet something fundamental within her had shifted. She understood now that silence was not neutral ground. It was always a decisive choice, one that inevitably protected some individuals at the profound expense of others. She had lived inside that oppressive silence for too long, accepting it as the necessary cost of survival. Watching it break, even for a brief, violent moment, had shown her an entirely different way of existing, one that did not rely solely on passive endurance. Inside, the manager finished locking up and turned off the overhead lights one by one. The diner settled into darkness, quiet and waiting. Tomorrow it would open again. People would return. Life would go on. But the memory would remain, carried quietly and deeply by those who had been there, not as a sensational story retold loudly, but as an understanding that had settled into their behavior, into their posture, and into the careful way people chose to look at one another. The waitress walked to her car and paused before climbing in, taking one last, long look at the building. It was still just a diner on a forgotten corner, worn and utterly ordinary. Yet for her, it had become the precise location where one significant thing had finally ended and something essential and new had begun. She drove away feeling tired, yes, but steadier and more anchored than she had been in a very long time. Fear had not vanished entirely from her life, but it no longer held absolute rule over it. She knew with certainty that silence could be shattered, and that once shattered, it never returned quite the same. Somewhere far beyond the reach of the diner's neon lights, the older man continued on his way, carrying with him no discernible need for acknowledgement or public praise. He had stepped in when it profoundly mattered, and then, just as effectively, he had stepped away. That was entirely enough. In the end, no grand speeches were delivered. No formal apologies were demanded. Justice did not arrive with ceremony or applause. It came quietly, through decisive action and its undeniable consequence, leaving behind a subtle but lasting tectonic change. And in that change, the diner finally learned how to breathe again. If the story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories like this. Watch the next video on your screen to keep the story going and share this video with someone who believes in justice. It really helps the channel.